All right. Now, in your email, so I wasn't paying attention to any of the email during the holiday, so that's why I didn't
Yeah,
see the one, which is very interesting that you talk about
yeah,
the Lavrov, talking
yeah,
about the
yeah,
Taiwan
yeah,
situation. And he mentioned this treaty of good neighborliness and friendly cooperation with China.
yeah.
And one of the principles, he said that document is mutual support in defending national unity and the territorial integrity.
Mm,
I interpret that as not necessarily militarily, right? But let's say
yes.
if China get into a conflict because of Taiwan, Russia will support China with all the natural resources, I guess. That
That is
kind of,
exactly right.
yeah,
China, China does not need Russian military help. I mean, to say it straightforwardly, I don't think anybody thinks that China
yeah,
needs Russia to come to its rescue in Taiwan or any of those places. I mean, China has a much bigger, far more powerful navy than Russia does. The Russians have a very powerful navy, but it's
mhm,
nuclear submarines and it's
yeah,
tasked to operate in the North Atlantic. It's not really geared for this kind of intervention. So, I mean, it's not a military agreement.
mhm,
But what China does want and is concerned about, and I've no doubt about this, is that the Americans are straightforwardly talking about blockades of,
mhm,
of China.
mhm,
There's much talk about how the seizure of Venezuela that they're
yeah,
trying to carry out is ultimately all about China too. Of course it is. Just to say that, I mean, there's no doubt about that. And what China needs, to the extent that it needs certain natural resources, oil, gas,
mhm,
and grain,
mhm,
and food, and other things of that kind, they will want an assurance that the Russians will provide them,
yeah.
and this is what the treaty does.
Yeah, it's a worst case scenario kind of a situation. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Okay, let's talk about this Venezuela situation.
Mm.
Um, there's new term, right? The Donald Doctrine. Okay, the Donald Trump's doctrine, Donald Doctrine.
Mm.
Okay, regarding the situation in Venezuela, can you explain to me what exactly just happened?
Well, I think about what happened in Venezuela is not actually very difficult to work out. There's been a deal done between the United States, the Trump administration, and some people within the Venezuelan government. I think this is now universally accepted. Even the media, the big media, are now talking about this. What we don't yet know is how many of these people in Venezuela there are and how many officials were involved. I've been told privately about one particular individual who I should say is not the vice president, who is now the president, Delcy Rodriguez.
Mm-hmm.
There are some suggestions that she was playing along with this too, and that she had meetings with the Americans in either Qatar or the UAE.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, the point was that some kind of deal was negotiated. It was negotiated over many weeks and months. The United States, I suspect, had this commando group, this force, New Delta Force group in Venezuela for some time. When the moment came, they were tipped off about Maduro's whereabouts. They seized Maduro, and a deal was done that the Venezuelan military, the bigger Venezuelan military, the air defenses, would not be activated, so that as soon as Maduro himself was captured, the Americans would be able to extract him from Venezuela, and that there would be no interference. Now, the big question is, and this is always the question with these sort of deals, which is who was ultimately manipulating whom. Obviously, the Americans were dealing with these people in Venezuela. They were no doubt bribing them to some extent. They were telling them, you do this and play ball with us and all will be well. But of course, one can see that there might be a Venezuelan calculation here as well, which is get Maduro to the United States, dump him.
Mm-hmm.
The Americans are obsessed with him.
Yeah.
Hand him over to the Americans. And after a time, the Americans will become bored with this whole affair and will leave us alone. So there might be some element of this at play. But ultimately, this was an internal putsch. It was a coup carried out by some elements within the Venezuelan power structure against the constitutional president, in which the actual work of seizing him and dealing with his Cuban bodyguards was dealt with by the United States.
So Maduro is not part of it. He's betrayed by his own people. Is that right?
Obviously, no doubt. And there's no doubt. I mean, I don't believe he's part of it.
Well, that probably explains why he used the Cuban bodyguards, right? So he must have some suspicion with his own bodyguards and his own protection forces, I guess.
Yes. That is exactly right. I mean, he clearly wasn't secure in Venezuela. He obviously knew it. Mm-hmm. He probably thought that the presence of the Cuban bodyguards would, to some extent, protect him from an internal coup. Mm-hmm. But of course, what happened was that the coup plotters worked with the Americans to carry it out instead. So that was probably what happened.
Okay. But this whole thing, from Americans' perspective, I just think Trump, what just did is unconstitutional. It's illegal. He didn't even inform the Congress, the Gang of Eight. It's not just that he didn't ask permission from the Congress. He didn't inform anybody. Instead, he talked to some oil executive, and he's open about it. He talked about that. He said, I talked to the oil executive before and after the coup or the incident.
I think this is one of the most astonishing and in some ways significant moments in modern history, because the President of the United States has openly and blatantly acted in an entirely legal manner. He did not inform Congress of what he was doing. He did not inform, apparently, it seems, many people within his own administration. This was an entirely rogue operation carried out in full public view by the president and his officials. There was no attempt to comply with international law in any form. The president of the United States seems to glory in that fact. And the extraordinary thing is that in previous times when the Americans have done similar things, and they have done, they've always tried to justify it by coming up with fairy tale words about democracy, freedom, human rights, liberty, all of that. This time, Trump isn't even bothering to do that. He's saying that, this is all about getting Venezuela's oil. Venezuela's oil is our oil. He now says that he's going to sell it himself and he's going to decide what's going to happen to the proceeds. I mean, it's quite extraordinary what he's doing. I mean, this is imperialism. It's pure, unalloyed 19th century imperialism, the sort of thing that the British and the French used to do during the 19th century and the 18th century. Only it's done without any embarrassment. Even in those days, I mean, the British tried to sort of pretend that they were promoting Christianity and free trade and all of that, even as they were forcing opium, not just upon the people of China, but other people. But this time, as I said, it's just open, brazenly, recklessly carried out in this astonishing way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We will get back to that. I do want to talk about Arnaud's article later. Okay. Yeah. The thing confusing is what's next? I always feel like whatever they do, I always have this question like, what's next? If I can just read you the mainstream articles, their titles, you can see the confusion here. AP says, Rubio says U.S. won't govern Venezuela, but will press charges through oil blockade. The New York Times says, Trump says U.S. is in charge of Venezuela. Well, Rubio stresses coercing it. And then LA Times says, to run Venezuela, Trump presses existing regime to kneel. So are they going to send Rubio to become some kind of a governor, or they're going to continue to work with the existing one? It's very confusing to me.
Well, I think the reason it's confusing is because the Americans themselves don't know. I mean, they've carried out this operation. They've seized Maduro. They've put him before a court in New York on absurd charges, by the way. I mean, I read the indictment and it didn't make much sense to me. And the key charge that they've been making against him over the last couple of months, that it was all about drugs and all of that, that turned out to be untrue. I mean, you know, they are openly admitting that this giant criminal cartel of which he was supposed to be the leader, it doesn't even exist. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. But I don't get the sense that there's a plan. People from Congress who've met with them came out saying that they didn't see anything that resembled a plan. I think different people are saying different things because there's no single agreed policy on what to do and how to take this forward. Because there's been an internal coup in Venezuela itself, which is incomplete. Because the Venezuelans who were part of this plot relied on the Americans rather than deploying their own forces on the ground. And so their own position in Venezuela is extremely insecure. And it's uncertain on which side the new interim leader, Rodriguez, actually is. And of course, there's large forces, there's militias and military forces, and it doesn't seem that they're fully on side either. So we have all of these various statements, contradictory statements from the United States. Secretary Rubio himself doesn't seem to be at all keen to go to Venezuela and act as a viceroy there. I mean, you know, even though he's been apparently the major advocate behind all of this, as is always the way with the Americans, they have this assumption that if they demonize the one person who's in charge and then remove him, everything else will flow easily. Perhaps it will, but at the moment, it doesn't seem that it will. And I don't really get much of a sense that they have a clear idea of what to do going forward.
I got the feeling, unless they just let the existing government to pretty much doing what they have been doing, anything else will be very chaotic. I just got that sense.
Well, the extraordinary thing about that is that the Americans apparently are agreeing with you. I say this because there have been reports over the last couple of days that Rubio, the Secretary of State, met with Machado, the major Venezuelan opposition leader, was completely unimpressed by her, that the Americans altogether were unimpressed with the Venezuelan opposition. They very quickly concluded that these people aren't in a position to maintain control of the country. So that's why they've tried to cut a deal with elements of the existing government. But of course, that leaves the existing government in place, and except the government itself is now unstable because there will be some people in it who are probably still loyal to Chavez and Maduro and to the legacy and the policies that those people pursued. And then there were others who, of course, have taken bribes and have been corrupted by the United States, and there will be massive mistrust and uncertainty, and people will be wondering who was behind this and who's involved. And it's entirely possible the entire country could start to collapse because of the mistrust and uncertainty and doubts that must exist within it. Now, this is a country which is full of weapons. I mean, every village, apparently people there are heavily armed. It is a huge country. I mean, apparently you have to go to Venezuela to understand how big it is. Caracas itself is an enormous, teeming city, very difficult to control. And if you're talking about the rest of the country, it's made up of jungles and mountains, Andes. It's natural territory, for various groups and factions to stake out their own territory, and it could very, very easily fragment unless this thing is handled intelligently. And what intelligence do you see coming from Washington?
It's interesting. Trump himself dismissed the Machado, right? He even said that you don't have the popular support. So I find that fascinating.
Yes.
I mean, so if they don't want the current government to continue to govern, I'm not sure they even know which opposition leader they would support, right?
You put your finger on the whole problem. I mean, they removed Maduro, assuming that the current government will work with them, and assuming that this current government will remain in control and continue to be stable. Neither of these things are givens. I mean, it's very easy to see how it could all turn out completely wrong.
Yeah. One of the questions is, of course, the oil. Now, I did some reading. It sounds to me like even the Venezuela oil is not that easy to process. It's kind of like hard oil. I mean, oil and oil are different. The Saudi oil regarded as the primary, and the U.S. Texas oil has also that kind of quality. But the Venezuela oil is not the high quality oil. It's very expensive to extract and processing it, right?
Absolutely. It's extremely expensive to access. It's extremely expensive to process. The Venezuelan oil industry has been under sanctions for many years. It has deteriorated very badly. Many of the pipes and things like that in Venezuela are in a very poor condition. I've seen estimates that it would take $100 billion at least in investment and around a decade to bring production back up to its early 2000s level. And even then, it would be much more expensive than any of the oil that we see today. I read somewhere that extracting oil in Venezuela is 10 times more expensive than doing so in Saudi Arabia. And that might be an underestimate, by the way. And of course, all of this at a time of low oil prices. So why American oil companies would want to go to Venezuela with all of these political uncertainties and take on this enormous operation is very, very difficult to understand. Again, one senses that the Trump people didn't figure that out in advance. And apparently the latest word is that they're trying to bribe the oil companies to go there by offering them subsidies paid for by American taxpayers, which tells you, again, how completely unthought out this whole thing is.
Maduro already offered, said you can you can come to my country to start. I can give you access to my oil reserve. Why isn't that a lot easier just to have a deal with Maduro? Because that will make it much more legitimate. He was elected president. And on the side, okay, we will talk about China later, but if you need investment, maybe you can bring in China as well to help with the infrastructure and something. Isn't that a much more sensible and easier way to do things?
Well, of course it is. It is not just sensible, it's rational. It is the obvious and rational thing to do. I mean, bear in mind the reason oil production in Venezuela collapsed and the oil fields are in this critical condition. It's not because the Venezuelans turned off their oil supply or refused to sell oil to the United States. It's because the United States imposed sanctions on Venezuela. It was the Americans who led this process, not the Venezuelans. The Venezuelans have always been willing to have the Americans in Venezuela developing the oil fields, operating the fields to some extent, and helping and pumping oil to the United States. The entire premise of the original Chavez revolution, if you like, I mean, it was never a violent revolution. I mean, he came to power through elections. But Chavez's plan was that Venezuela would continue to export oil in the same way that it always had, but that instead of the profits from the exports of oil going to a small number of powerful oligarchs and business people in Venezuela and being siphoned off to the oil companies, a larger share would go to the Venezuelan government, which would reinvest the money in education and healthcare programs to benefit the Venezuelan people. That is what Chavez was seeking to do. He never sought to push the Americans completely out of the oil industry. And he never sought to stop exports of oil to the United States. That was never part of his plan. It undercut his plan. It contradicted his plan to do any one of these things. So obviously and absolutely, going back to what you say, there was absolutely nothing to prevent the United States doing a deal with Maduro, the president the internationally recognized president of Venezuela, making all of those deals, returning to the oil industry, getting the oil industry back in working order. It would have taken a lot of time, a lot of money. China could have certainly helped in the process, and that would have shared the cost. And, well, everybody would have benefited in that way. But, of course, the Americans don't think in that way at all. They have to have total control. They didn't like the fact that Chavez wanted to control the oil industry's profits in order to reinvest some of them in, as I said, internal domestic development. And of course, the idea of sharing anything with China is absolutely abhorrent to them.
And Trump even said that, the report says the White House is demanding Venezuela reduce relationship with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. Now, Trump himself said, okay, Russia and Iran, they have oil themselves. So clearly it is about China.
Yeah.
But here's my question, though. Whatever just happened, you don't change the fact oil itself is not money. You need to sell it, okay? And of course, there's a whole lot of things need to be done before you can sell it. And then who you sell to. You can't get around the fact that China is the biggest oil purchasing. It doesn't change that.
No, of course not. What Trump is actually threatening, let's assume he manages to get what he wants. Let's say he increases production in Venezuela, but ensures that none of it will go to China. What actually is that going to do? We already have an oil glut at the moment. There's more oil than there is a need for, which is causing pressure on prices. There's been much talk about how this price pressure hurts the Russians and the Iranians, and to some extent it does. But of course, what it also does is it hurts the American oil industry, who are major supporters of Donald Trump. And by the way, production of oil in the United States is not particularly cost efficient. Apparently, the break-even price there is $60 a barrel. So there isn't that much, leeway to push the oil price down further than it already is. Canada is a major oil producer. Canada's a major oil producer. Canadian oil is very similar to Venezuelan. It's tar. It comes from tar, very like the Venezuelan oil. This would destroy the Venezuelan oil industry. What Trump is threatening to do, if it is successful, if he restricts exports in the way that he is saying, is that he will be creating an oil industry in Venezuela that will compete directly with those in Canada and the United States. Now, I don't see how that benefits the United States. And yes, China is the world's biggest importer of oil. But we go back to our early comment in the program. There is always a supplier that China can rely on, and that is Russia. So China is covered from that point of view. One of the things the Chinese probably will want to do is to focus more on pipelines as opposed to shipping. But that's a long-term project, and China, as we know, is very good at long-term projects. So China will come through this. If you want to wage economic war against China, this makes no sense. Economic war against China makes no sense anyway. I mean, it doesn't make sense. But certainly, they're not going to achieve any of their geopolitical objectives as a result of what they have done, even assuming that this operation over the medium to long term turns out successful.
Another thing I don't think Trump think about at all, he should have learned by now that anytime when you push China to the corner, China will figure out some way. Yeah. So when you have incidents like that, it kind of reminds China how important energy independence is. Now, of course, China is looking for resources everywhere to diversify. Okay. But in the meantime, China is also working on alternative energy, right? Renewable energies. And China actually recently had a big breakthrough in fusion.
Yeah.
My understanding, now these things takes time, a breakthrough until it's commercialized, it will be a while. But this absolutely will speed up. It will force China to speed up this process to make it commercialized very quickly. My understanding is once it's been done, in principle, it should provide electricity for the whole world for up to 20,000 years. Now, again, it would take a while. But these type of technology development and advancement, China will only speed it up to the degree that one day they might not need that much oil, right?
Well, indeed. Well, actually, you make an excellent point because, I mean, China is already at the forefront in thorium nuclear reactor technology. They're working, as you said, on fusion. They are the world's leaders in batteries and in solar power. And that lead is growing, by the way. They also have massive hydropower programs. China's actual imports of oil are falling.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something people have not been noticing. And China's energy mix is gradually shifting, and it will continue to shift away from oil. Now, the point is that Trump is obsessed with oil to a degree that is really bizarre. But he is thinking about the technology and the economics of the 1970s. I mean, he's fixated with that. In fact, what he is doing is that he is keeping the United States in energy terms invested in the technology that is being displaced. He doesn't seem to get this. Even the Saudis, who are major oil producers, understand this. This is what the Crown Prince MBS has been trying to do in Saudi Arabia. Look for an economic future for the kingdom beyond oil. They could see that oil is yesterday's energy. Trump is fixated with the technology and the energy of yesterday. And he's not looking at what the situation is actually like today. And he doesn't even acknowledge that there is a tomorrow.
Yeah. Another thing is, I agree with you. It's all about control. It's all about power over other people. But here's the thing. If you look at Argentina, Milei, somebody Trump really likes. Yeah. But guess what? Argentina was selling soybeans to China, basically backstabbing the United States, right, in terms of this trade war. So even the people who he likes, he cannot be in full control. I mean, they have to do things what is best for their own country at the end of the day, isn't it?
Absolutely, and for themselves too, because of course if Milei doesn't, then I mean, you know, he's going to start to lose elections, and he's going to start turning critical parts of his electoral base against him, and his donors who are in the farming industries and things of that kind, and they depend on exports of soybeans and agricultural products to China. By the way, the same was true in Brazil. When Bolsonaro replaced Lula, Bolsonaro, very friendly to the United States, made some comments about China, but critically dependent on the big agricultural companies and businesses in Brazil. And they said, look, we've got to continue this trade with China because this is the trade that keeps us going. So again, the only way that the United States can stop that is by going directly into these countries and taking control of them itself. We discussed before in the program that we did about the new security strategy review that the United States has published, where they talk about basically excluding other countries from outside the hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, and of course they mean China, from trade with the countries of the Western Hemisphere, and obliging Latin American countries to trade exclusively with the United States. That is a colonial tyranny, which it will require enormous resources for the United States to sustain. I mean, they would need to establish bases all over the Latin American continent. They would have to take direct control of the governments there. they would have to impose an apparatus of control and resource extraction from Latin America, which is inevitably going to provoke enormous resistance. Mm-hmm. Now, Trump doesn't show much appetite to do that. So what does he do? He tries to find willing collaborators in Venezuela and Argentina and all of these places. But ultimately, they cannot deliver what he wants, because to the extent that they remain responsible for these countries they rule, they have to adapt to the true trading conditions. There is no other way.
I really like the Arnaud Bertrand's article, The Venezuela Killed the US, because a lot of things I didn't think a whole lot before. So, for example, one thing, he said a nation needs a story. Now, that story pretty much is now dead. The story for the United States is fundamentally a good country. Okay, it's not perfect, but it is a good country. But what Trump did is, never mind. Okay, we're not that good. We just want their oil. We want this, we want that. And you have to, just do what we say. Okay, and we will kidnap your president. We will seize your oil field or what have you. So forget about democracy or this and that. And so that story is now dead. And that is fundamentally hurting the United States. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And can I say, as a Greek, I can give you direct historical example of this. Mm-hmm. It's exactly what Arnaud Bertrand said. And by the way, he also made some very interesting points about China and its very different philosophies, which we will come to. But there's a direct analogy here, which is that it's from ancient Greek history, which is Athens, my native city, the city where I was born. Well, in the 5th century, it was the great democracy in ancient Greece. It was the country that supported democracies across ancient Greece. At least that was the narrative that it spun. It was the story that it built around itself. It was essentially the city of freedom and culture and all of those things. And then, of course, it became a great power. It became increasingly brutal. And there was a small state called Melos, which it attacked and said that you must come under our control. And the Melians, the people of Melos, said, we don't want to. We want to be free. We're not hostile to you. We want to be neutral. We don't want to be at war with you in any way. And the Athenians famously said to the Melians, of the gods we believe and of men we know, that the strong do as they will, and the weak do as they must. And you must obey, and if you don't obey, we will destroy you. And the Melians said, no, we won't obey. And Athens destroyed Melos. And that shocked all of Greece. And from being the city associated with democracy, Athens became the tyrant city. Mm-hmm. And within 10 years, it had been defeated in war and had been completely overthrown, and it lost its position of primacy. I mean, it was might is right. That kind of cynical, brutal doctrine is always the sign, when it happens, it is always the sign of a state that has lost all bearings and all moderation and all self-control and is about to collapse.
Yeah. And yes, I agree that he used the Chinese example, which I even didn't think much before, which is the Qin dynasty, right? The Qin is, they're the legalist. Right. And then the later Han dynasty was the Confucianist, right? So, and he compared the two, and the legalist is very much what the Athens were doing. Okay, we basically by force, everything is done by force, right? You have to obey. You have to.
Yes.
Even though Qin itself is a very powerful emperor. I mean, and unified China at the time. Yes. But it lasted like 15 years.
Yes.
But the Han dynasty lasted 400 years, and which is, I'm a Han Chinese, so the Han dynasty have profound impact for all the Chinese.
Yeah. Absolutely, it's an astoundingly good point, actually. Yeah. And as you absolutely rightly say, I mean, the Han dynasty has had an enormous effect on Chinese people's understanding of themselves and of who they are, and of the difference in culture, and of the nature of virtue, and of the importance of virtue in government, and that people ultimately are attracted to a government that seeks to be virtuous and beneficial. It is put off by a government, however efficient and strong it appears to be, which is exclusively about power and about retaining control. And you're absolutely right. Qin and Han was one of the most dynamic figures that Chinese history has ever produced. He built roads, he unified the writing system, he developed the weights and measures and the distances. He did all kinds of extraordinary things. He built the first Great Wall. He did amazing things, and he unified China. But he failed to create a system that could outlast him. Because when he was gone, when the energy and brutality and charisma and authority that was bound up with his person, and the fear that was bound up with his person, was no longer there, nobody felt any loyalty to it. There was no desire to perpetuate his system, which people saw as cruel and oppressive, and which offered them nothing beyond, as I said, these efficient things that he did. Whereas the Han dynasty, operated in a completely different way, and as a result obtained and achieved the extraordinary loyalty of the people right up until almost its end.
Yeah. And also that also explained throughout the Chinese history, all the Huangdi, they always seek legitimacy, right? They talk a lot about moral and being the leader. Absolutely. You should be morally. They talk a lot about that, and there were a lot of
Absolutely.
Writings about that. That explains.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know whether this expression, this concept actually even exists in China, whether people talk about it. What we talk about in China, the Chinese dynasties having the concept of the mandate of heaven.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And I mean, whether, as I said, this is a Western attempt to try to get a grasp on a Chinese thing, I think it does speak of something. I mean, a dynasty that is brutal and oppressive and corrupt and misbehaves, that uses force and tyranny, will not survive. And I've seen this because, I take an interest in Chinese history. And one of the things that really astonished me was an extraordinary argument. I think I've talked about it in previous programs, that took place in the Ming Dynasty. When one emperor died, one Huangdi died, and he had no sons, which is unusual, but he had no sons. So they had to find another prince to become Huangdi from another branch of the family. And then the question was it ethical that he treat the previous Huangdi as his father, or continue to be filial towards his own biological father? And this was seen as enormously important and hugely moral and ethical, and ethics were very, very strongly bound up by this. And it triggered a political crisis because people cared about these things. They wanted the Huangdi to be virtuous and to do right in the eye of heaven.
Yeah, legitimacy is always very, very important. And there is a very strict system, how after one Huangdi died, who should be the successor and all that kind of thing. And of course, not everybody follows that, but in principle, right, it's regarded as there is a system that everybody should follow. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the legitimacy. And so there's...
And another thing is this, which is a very interesting fact, which is that it's very, very rare in Chinese history, very rare for a Huangdi who has legitimacy to be overthrown by a member of his own dynasty. I mean, I'm not saying it's completely unheard of. I mean, there was an incident. I mean, the Huangdi, one of the second Huangdi of the Ming dynasty, was overthrown by his uncle. Compared to European history, it is extremely unusual because he was the Huangdi, he was expected to behave in a certain way, and everyone else, including the members of his family, however ambitious they were, had to acknowledge and respect that fact. And to do otherwise was to violate the moral order.
Yeah. And even that Huangdi, he overthrew his nephew. He would never have done that if his brother, the older brother, inherited the throne. Because his older brother is the oldest son, which is the tradition that he should be the one. But then, of course, he died early. So his son became the Huangdi, and that's when there's a problem. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Anyway, the other thing I find also interesting is that I think I kind of get the answer to what really happens right now, what Arnold explained. Because right now what happened is because Trump is this person, no longer has any moral compass. That explains why the law doesn't work, right? Yeah. You see the tariffs and invading Venezuela, and then the Epstein file, these are all laws that he's supposed to obey, follow. He just, in defiance, he totally ignored them. So that's also proof us the legalist doesn't work without moral compass, right?
No, of course not. Absolutely. It is a fundamental principle of law that law places a limit on its own creators and its own enforcers. And it must, as a result, it must have a moral purpose. I mean, by the way, this is very well understood amongst jurists and legal philosophers, including in the West. If it doesn't have that moral purpose, then it is not law, because it is not justice any longer. And if its creators and enforcers accept no limits amongst themselves, on themselves, from law, then again, it is not law. In fact, it becomes anti-law. It really does become violent and brutal and oppressive and tyrannical. And at that point, nobody feels any respect or any moral obligation to obey it. I have commented about this myself, and I said that what Trump has done is that he has made the United States a psychopathic superpower. Psychopaths, and I used to in my previous career, I had to deal with lots of them, by the way. I met many psychopaths, and I mean, the point about them is that they have no self-restraints and no moral compass. They are people basically who have nothing that we would recognize as a conscience. They act purely in their own naked self-interest as they understand it. And that, it seems to me, is what the United States is now becoming.
It is stunning to me, seriously, watching Trump just violating the Constitution, not to follow the rules, the laws, or what have you. It's absolutely stunning to me, because I was growing up believing in the United States, all men are created equal, in front of the law, in the face of the law, everybody's equal, nobody can just get a special treatment. I grown up with that idea. It's simply not true, I guess.
Well, I not only grew up with it, I pursued a career in law because I believed in it. And I worked I gave 12 years of my life as a court official on that assumption. And I mean, for me, it is incredibly difficult, deeply upsetting to see all this being thrown aside in the way that it has been. And of course, Trump, as many people have correctly said, he's only the culmination of a process that began some while back. We've seen repeatedly in Europe, as well as in the United States, law and legal process violated. And what makes this thing even more astonishing is that one of the people who was the victims of this process, this ongoing process, was Trump himself. Maduro is being prosecuted on absolutely nonsensical charges in the Southern District of New York, where Donald Trump was previously prosecuted on nonsensical charges. I mean, it tells you that law has been instrumentalized as a mechanism of political factions. And that, by definition, means that it is no longer law, not in any sense that a true jurist would ever recognize.
Yeah, it's not just Trump. I totally agree. I mean, if you watch that on Air Force One, there was an interview shortly after what happened. He was glowing. He was very happy, Trump himself. Yeah. So does other people. There were, Lutnick was there. Lindsey Graham was there. You see, when they talk about the natural resource in Venezuela, you almost could feel that they're almost like a drooling. You know, their eyes lit up. Oh, Venezuela had this and that. You know, there's endless opportunities. And it's other countries' assets. Yes. The way they talk about it, it's just absolutely stunning to me.
Yeah. But you see, the Europeans were not that different. Just a few weeks ago, they were trying to seize Russia's assets. Okay. At least they pretended that they were coming up with all sorts of legal ideas and conventions to do it. Trump, of course, has thrown all of that out. I mean, it's even thieves generally try to preserve some levels, you know, I'm talking about criminals now, try to preserve some concepts of structure and honor. This lot, I mean, they carry out this, they do this terrible thing, and they take pride in it. And as you said, they glow in it. I mean, it's wonderful. It seems wonderful for them. And as I said, they don't understand. They will choke on it. Let me put it like that. That, as I said, is the invariable lesson of history.
But they don't learn. I mean, this is not the first time they've done that in Latin America. The United States has been keep on doing this, right? The famous one was, of course, the Chile, the Allende. I immediately thought about that, and then, of course, they did a whole bunch of things in Guatemala, right? Panama. Okay, they arrested Noriega. All that kind of thing. None of them really turned out the way that they wanted. No. And the Chile thing is a big scandal. Still, a lot of us people very unhappy about what really happened, even though it's a long time ago.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, if you're talking about Latin America, the United States has interfered violently in Latin America for well over a century. Yeah. I mean, it's in fact going back to the 1890s and even before. I mean, wars of aggression against Mexico, wars of aggression against Venezuela. I mean, they carved Panama out of Venezuela so that they could build the canal there. They've overthrown governments. They practiced a policy in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s of supporting fascist dictatorships, I mean, general fascist dictatorships right across Venezuela, so that by the end of the 1970s, there was hardly a country in South America that could even approximate to the concept of a democracy. I mean, they have been brutal and violent towards the South Americans to an astonishing extent. What have they achieved? Has it made America rich? Has it made Americans happier? Has it achieved anything good for the United States? Has it made the United States more secure at the end of the day? After all, it's Americans who complain about the vast migrant flows into America from Latin America. Why do they think they're coming? Why do they think that Latin America is as dysfunctional as it is? Because they made it that way. I mean, they've never allowed these countries to develop and prosper and establish themselves securely as real functioning countries in the way that, say, the nations of Asia has done, China has done, for example.
But the U.S. never learned. So that's, they learned to repeat it. I mean, that's what Trump just did, right? To repeat what they did in the past. Yeah.
Absolutely. The other thing, of course, is that even if America as a whole has never benefited from this, individuals in the United States always do.
Yeah. Just United fruit, right? Yeah.
So. United fruit and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So China's reaction, this is interesting. There's a lot of discussion. Even I think Westerners are commenting now. Okay, now China could just go to Taiwan, arrest the Taiwan leader, and be done with it.
Who is actually illegitimate? Just saying. I mean, it's a fact. I mean, the Americans tell everybody that Maduro is illegitimate. The Russians say Zelensky's illegitimate too. I've never supported them on that one, by the way. I've always said this is none of their business. The world recognizes Taiwan as part of China.
Yeah.
The United States recognizes Taiwan as part of China. Given that this is so, how can anybody who calls themselves the president of Taiwan be legitimate?
Yeah.
Just say.
And in particular now, there is, of course, nobody in the Western mainstream report about that. There is a recall effort now. And the people are signing petitions to ask him to resign. They have collected more signatures than the votes he received in 2024 presidential election. So that many people want him to resign because he's so corrupt and incompetent, all that kind of thing. But nobody talking about that, right? Maduro is illegitimate, but he is actually, his own people are really want him to get out. Nobody talking about that. As you said, if China does this, it has all the legitimacy to do so. China has right to do so. Yeah, absolutely.
Perhaps they will. As I said, they have absolute right to do it, and it might actually prove beneficial in the long term, because of course, to repeat again, the central point: Venezuela is an independent, sovereign country. It gained independence of Spain all the way back in the 19th century. It is a well-established part of the international system, of the international community of nations. Taiwan is not a nation.
No.
It has always been acknowledged by the international community that it is not a nation. The government of Taiwan, or rather let's call it the government that functions inside Taiwan, itself says the same. It does not say that it is the government of Taiwan. It says it is the government of China, a point which people in the West always ignore. So, given that it is universally recognized around the world, except by a few Micronesian countries and whatever, that the government of China is the government that is in Beijing. And it is overwhelmingly accepted by Chinese people, not just in China, but the Chinese diaspora as well, by the way, overwhelmingly, that is the government of China. Why should not the government of China arrest somebody who is claiming to be the president of China, not of Taiwan, but who is keeping a part of the China and doing so illegally, and who is keeping a part of Chinese territory separated from the rest of the country? I would have said the Chinese have an overwhelmingly strong case if that is what they now decide to do.
Yeah. And the public opinion within the Taiwan island is also shifting. So even the former vice president, who used to be very pro-independent, Xi now came out, made it very clear Taiwan is part of China. I was stunned when I saw her. Like, she has always been this, we are very different, very unique, blah, blah. So all of a sudden now, Taiwan is part of China, obviously, according to her.
Well, of course it is. If anybody cared about Taiwan, or at least the people who live there, they would be facilitating reunification. The Americans don't want to do it's the Americans who basically don't want reunification, because they talk about Taiwan as the unsinkable aircraft carrier, and they've got all of the industries there that make the microchips that America itself cannot make. Just to say.
But China faces a dilemma, I think. Here is somebody on X, actually, I think summarized it very well. So this woman, Corinne, she said, the world is asking China a question it has avoided answering for decades. When the United States begins to kidnap foreign leaders, invade weaker nations, plunder the resources of small countries, and carry out terrorist attacks with bombs, do you intend to remain silent or prepare to become the order itself? China certainly doesn't want to answer, because answering means transforming from a builder of civilization into a guardian of the rules. But Trump's empire isn't maintaining order, it's creating neo-Nazism. Venezuela is the first, Mexico, Colombia are the second, and ultimately every small country will understand peace is not a right, but an insurance policy bought with nuclear weapons. The world will push China to the forefront, not because of its rise, but because there is no one else. This is the irony of the new order. the United States proves itself with bombs, while China is forced to prove its civilization with restraint. I think that's a good summary.
It's a very powerful summary. It's a very, very good one. I think that China would be very, very unwilling to start getting into that kind of contest, a global contest with the United States. And I'm just going to say something here, which I think is based on my understanding of China and Chinese people and Chinese history and Chinese governance. I think what the Chinese will say to themselves is, at the end of the day, our best policy is to go on doing what we're doing, to make the Chinese people better, stronger, to make China itself stronger. And if we do that, if we focus on ourselves, and we're big enough and strong enough to be able to do that, and we have enough reliable friends in order to do that, then eventually we will prevail, because we will prevail through virtue. Going straight back to what Arnaud Bertrand was talking about. And I do believe this. Again, this is perhaps my own culture, my Greek culture. There's an expression that one doesn't hear very much, which is that human beings are always in the end drawn to the light. It's a Greek expression. And I think that this is true. Ultimately, what will happen is that the United States will weaken itself, will discredit itself, will sap the bonds of its own society, will achieve cultural collapse. And perhaps that is when China needs to step in. And the way it steps in is not by rivaling in America and becoming its opposite, but by remaining China and being itself.
Yeah, and regarding this, you talk about the timing there was a Chinese delegation visiting, and Maduro was meeting them during the day, and then a few hours later he was kidnapped. According to the Chinese media, he actually was informed that China did inform him that the attack is coming in a few hours. A few hours before that, it's even possible during that meeting he had with them, they told him. He was arrested in a military base, not in the presidential palace, right? So if this is an internal job, it's very hard for anybody to protect him, I think.
Yeah, interesting. I think that must be right. Interesting that, because this has not been reported in the media, by the way, here, that the China actually gave him a tip-off. Interesting to know whether he accepted it, whether he took it.
Well, I didn't read it. I don't find much detail other than China did remind him that the attack is coming, which actually reminds me what happened with Allende, the Chilean situation. Zhou Enlai actually also reminded him and told him, you need to look here, be careful with your own military stuff like that. And he laughed about it. He said he simply didn't believe that his own people would do something like that. Right? So,
yes, that's absolutely true. I know that. I know about that story. I've heard it myself. And it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. And I can absolutely imagine that something like this happened in Venezuela. One of the great problems, and this is another thing that one has to say, is that people are often very critical of China, and by the way of Russia too, when these things happen. But they never ask themselves the really important question, what have these countries done to help themselves? And very often they haven't done very much. And very often they've spurned offers of help which have been made to them. And there's all kinds of reasons, no doubt, why they do that. But as I said, if people don't want to be helped, then it's all but impossible to help them.
And then also in the long run, in the short term, the U.S. look like some kind of a victory, victorious. In the long run, somehow things always work out. Somehow that eventually Russia and China will ultimately become the beneficiary. I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, yes, I absolutely agree with that. I think that is absolutely true. I mean, that's why I say I think the best policy is to wait. I mean, there is a very cynical expression that you sometimes hear that is never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. And what the United States is doing is making one mistake on top of every other mistake. All of the regime change operations and the interventionist wars that the United States has waged have ended up weakening the United States and discrediting it. China has done none of those things. None of those things. And it's become richer and stronger and more widely respected, and is now seen, exactly as that message on X said, as the other pole. Who is getting stronger and who is getting weaker? And if we talk about the United States, I read this as well, bogging China down in all kinds of other places. Who is getting bogged down? The Americans themselves are. They're now going to have to worry about Venezuela and who comes out on top in Caracas. I mean, doesn't the president of the United States have more useful and important things to do?
Yeah, and then the same thing with some of the MAGA, I guess, supporters they were cheering. I just find it's very interesting that, do they know that we are now a week into 2026? There has already been 4 mass shootings. 166 people killed in gun violence. Wow. Not a single person from the Epstein file has been arrested. So Trump could arrest another country's leader, but not Epstein file pedophiles. Not a single one of them. So what's there to celebrate? What's there to be to be proud of? I'm puzzled at these people.
Well, exactly, so am I, actually. But I mean, it is unfortunately very much the style. And again, I think here, I'm sorry to say this again, but I think here you reveal again your Chinese side, which is that you say to yourself, well, what have you actually achieved?
Yeah.
You've made yourself obnoxious. You can't even run your own affairs. All you've done is you've gone off and you've beaten up someone else and you feel proud of it. And that's absolutely correct. But I think in the West, not just in the US, we have difficulty understanding this.
Yeah, I'm very practical. I mean, Chinese are very practical. Like,
absolutely.
What exactly you were doing, right? Well,
indeed. Well, I know, which is the virtuous thing, by the way. It's a fundamental mistake. The point I make many times, that to think that realist foreign policies are cynical foreign policies. Realism is not cynical or having no moral sense or value. It is being realist foreign policies. It's being realistic about the world and about people. The kind of foreign policies the West is pursuing, which are purely cynical and fantastic and based on might is right, are not realistic, and they will fail.
Mm-hmm. And in particular, Trump, he likes spectacle. I think he always likes spectacle, a big show, put up a big show.
Theatre. Yeah. They've just seized a tanker, by the way, just before we did this program. Another example of theatre and spectacles and all of this. Yes.
So next, even the countries, it's not you and me are speculating. They openly said, okay, Cuba, Panama, Mexico, Iran, Greenland, they are all coming. Okay, they are the next. So let's talk about a little bit about Greenland, because it's concerns Europe. Now, the latest I saw, there are several countries like France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, UK, and Denmark. They have a joint statement. Yeah. So does the Nordic countries. I don't see much report, but the Swedish foreign ministry website also put another very similar announcement together with Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. So what they're saying here, you see the Swedish one, it says at the end, we collectively reiterate that the matters concerning Denmark and Greenland are for Denmark and Greenland to decide alone. And this France, Germany, Italy one, it says Greenland belongs to its people. It is with Denmark and Greenland and them only to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. So these are the official statement from the European countries. What's your take on that?
I think they're incredibly feeble statements, and they don't go anywhere near far enough. They don't say to the United States, for example, straightforwardly, that an attempt to seize Greenland from Denmark would be treated by the European states as an act of aggression, and that it would put in jeopardy and might easily end the whole Western alliance system. They don't, I mean, Denmark has talked like that, but none of the others have. And I think the Americans will be reading all of this, and they will be saying that these are weak people and they're not prepared to defend themselves or their people or their territories or one amongst them. And we can basically go ahead and do whatever we want. And I think the American calculation, I'm sorry to say this, is correct. I was watching my own Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, interviewed and about this on British television, BBC, and they asked him, what's the difference between what the Americans have done in Venezuela and what we've accused the Russians of doing in Ukraine? And he just avoided giving any kind of intelligent or even coherent answer to this. And you can see that these people, as I said, they're never going to stand up. Once upon a time, long ago, in the early 1980s, when the United States invaded Grenada, small Caribbean island, and overthrew its government, the British Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, whom I disliked and strongly opposed, by the way, just to say, she was absolutely furious about this. She telephoned President Reagan. She spoke in the strongest terms, saying how unacceptable that sort of behavior was. Have we seen anything like that from anybody in Europe? No.
Yeah, it's such a irony in a way, because the Europeans are very much afraid of Russia. They talked so much about the Russian aggression. Turns out, the United States is the aggressor here, because Russia never said go beyond the Ukraine, right? Even Ukraine was kind of like forced into it in some sense. But here you have the president of the United States just saying, I want Greenland, just like that.
Absolutely, yes.
And there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. It seems like
nothing they can do. They can't even properly come out and complain or condemn what the Americans are talking about and say that this is unacceptable and must not be tolerated. They can't do it. And you're absolutely right. Why are they in this position? Firstly, because they are, as I said, weak countries, weak leaders, but also precisely because they remain fixated by Russia. And they know that they can't take on Russia without the help of the United States. So in the end, they will do nothing. They will go on talking about Russian aggression, even as it is American aggression that they're really facing. Because as you absolutely rightly say, the Russians have not attacked any European country, any NATO or EU country. They have gone out of their way repeatedly to say that they have no intention of doing anything of that kind. They have no territorial claims against any European country. They have certain security concerns, which were what led to the crisis in Ukraine. But they've always been prepared to talk and negotiate about that. The trouble is the Europeans won't talk to them.
And Zelensky is still trying so hard to get into NATO, right? What's the point of having NATO? NATO doesn't guarantee you anything. It's clear, right?
Well,
Denmark is in the NATO. Okay.
Well, indeed, quite. If I have to be honest, I mean, in spite of the passivity of the Europeans, I think NATO is now on life support. Not because the Europeans want to ditch it, but because the United States no longer cares about it. I mean, there was a whole circus in Paris yesterday and the day before about giving security guarantees to Ukraine, and the Americans refused to give any, basically. I mean, they said all sorts of nice things about Ukraine, but they refused to provide Ukraine with any security guarantees. I don't think they care, bluntly.
Now, there is a British guy, Rory Stewart. He was a former MP, and he has his own show now. He was also, I think, in David Cameron's cabinet and Theresa May's, right? So he seems to me like a mainstream kind of a politician or former politician. So on his latest show, he actually said that he's hoping that what happened in Venezuela, that really wake up Europe, that Europe and its democratic allies need to wake up to the threat by the U.S. I find that stunning that somebody, pretty mainstream, say it out loud. So are people gradually waking up to the fact the U.S. is a threat to Europe?
Right, Rory Stewart, just to say and to explain to your viewers, is as mainstream in Britain as it gets. I mean, he was very much the person that many people in the British liberal establishment wanted to become prime minister instead of Boris Johnson, just to say. So, I mean, he's a fairly well-known politician in Britain. He was quite widely liked, by the way, and he's very, very mainstream. And yes, I think that below the surface, there is going to be a lot of people in Britain, in Europe and in Britain, who will say, look, this is not an America that is a protector. This is an America which is an abuser and a predator. And we must find ourselves ways to protect ourselves from it. But look at the state of Europe. I mean, our economies are in very, very bad shape. We have not developed a single social media company. No, but we haven't. I mean, there's no equivalent to the kind of social media companies that you find in the United States or in China or, by the way, in Russia. We are behind in pretty much every sphere, technological sphere. We've fallen behind China in electric cars. Our industries are collapsing. We see major deindustrialization processes take hold in Germany. And in the conflict in Ukraine, we've discovered that we aren't able remotely to match the Russians in military weapons production. So we are in a very, very weak position. And if we are going to start taking steps to protect ourselves from a very aggressive and very predatory and very dangerous United States, we need to do two things. Firstly, we need to rethink and reassess the true state of Europe, and we need to shift completely our foreign policies. And our leaders are so invested in the existing system that they don't seem willing to do either of those things.
I was just thinking the Baltic countries, right? Kaya Kallas, for example. I think all these three countries, they must be really scared of what really happened. Because if this can happen to Venezuela, what stopped Putin from doing something similar to any of these countries? They should be the one who condemn this strongly. But
absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of commentaries now about this in the media. There was an article that I read on Unheard by a British commentator called Poppy Sowerby, who is quite well known. Again, she's on the sort of establishment towards somewhat to the right. But she said, we're now entering spheres of influence. The Americans want their own sphere of influence. The Russians are going to carve out their sphere of influence. What happens to us? Where do the Baltic states fall into this? What about the states in the Balkans? Are they all going to become part of the Russian sphere of influence? The Russians perfectly capable of acting in this way and doing all of these things. So yes, they should be afraid of this, but none of them have the courage to say it. And some of them remain so obsessed about Russia that they won't. I mean, there's this expression which comes from the Bible, by the way. They are the most blind who will not see.
Before I let you go, I do want to talk a little bit about Donald Trump, the person. Okay, I used to think that he's better than Biden. I no longer feel that way.
No.
Maybe whoever is not in power is better than the person in power. Maybe that's what my mentality is. I just feel like the latest one, this assassination to Putin, it seems like the CIA is involved. Why would Trump do something like that?
Well, indeed,
and what he did with Maduro, and also he's the one under him was, remember Meng Wanzhou was kidnapped under him. There's one more incident. I don't know if you paid attention. Not long ago, New York Times or Wall Street Journal reported that Kim Jong-un, remember he always called Kim Jong-un his friend, blah blah. When they were negotiating in 2018. He also ordered a Navy SEAL to put a device on undersea cable. And that, of course, operation didn't go very well. The nearby fishermen from North Korea saw those people. They didn't know who they were. They thought these are the people in trouble. They were trying to rescue them, to help them. And they all got killed. Not only that, they opened up their stomach to get water in so that the body won't float on the surface. So as you can imagine, when the body were found, how gruesome that could be, how horrible those look like. So he's negotiating with Kim Jong-un and doing something like that. He's now negotiating with Putin and doing something like that. And he was, at the time, negotiating with Xi Jinping. In the meantime, kidnapping Meng Wanzhou. He's an evil person, I feel.
Yes, this is the behavior of a gangster. And the way he talks increasingly has a gangster quality about it. And he's becoming more reckless in his behavior all the time and more dangerous. I mean, we have to accept that the United States is now a rogue state, led by a rogue president who, as I said, accepts no limits, and who accepts no limits in what he can do. So I agree with you. I mean, I'm not going to say that I miss Biden, but Trump is turning out to be more dangerous still. I have a theory, by the way, about the assassination attempt on Putin, which is that I think it was the Russians who told the Americans where Putin supposedly was at this residence in Valdai, whereas in fact, in reality, he was always in the Kremlin, just to say. And I think they did that in order to see what the Americans would do. I say that because I read the comments that Putin's foreign policy aide, Ushakov, made out afterwards. And he was almost laughing about this incident in ways that I did find very strange. And I have to say, it did seem to me that this was a gotcha moment, basically, that they discovered, and Putin then confronted Trump directly and said, "Do you know what the Ukrainians did?" And Trump said, "I'm shocked," and all of the denials. And I think the Russians just saw through the whole thing like a pane of glass.
Yeah, and then he kept on saying he's best friend with this, and he has a really good relationship with that. He constantly saying that.
Yes, I know.
I don't understand. Why is he behaving like that? Why can't you just conduct a honest diplomacy? Why can't you just do that?
Well, he clearly can't. I mean, because as I said, I think you put it very well. I mean, he's a very bad person, and you can't expect very bad people to behave in that sort of way. I mean, he's also fundamentally, and I think this is the thing I need to say this, he is fundamentally, as a statesman, extremely stupid. I'm not saying that Trump as a person is stupid. I mean, he's very clever in some things and very cunning in other things and all sorts of things of that kind. But he doesn't understand that what he's doing is ultimately destroying him. It's making it, I mean, you remember when we discussed the meeting in South Korea, the recent one between Xi Jinping and Trump, and the extraordinary manner in which the two leaders, Xi and Trump, were behaving. Trump fawning, over Xi, and Xi looking, I thought, cold, icy, and very disciplined. There was clearly contempt, this is my own feeling, contempt on the one side, and a sort of groveling fear on the other. That was how it looked to me. And you can see how it's going to play out, and it's going to be more and more like that over the course of this year. That's my own thoughts.
Yeah, when he feels that he didn't achieve much for his first year in office, so he got more and more agitated, I guess, and then he would do more these kind of outrageous things. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Let's see what happens. There's so much going on. Yeah.
Indeed. Have a very good week, Sophia. We'll speak next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sophia.
Bye.